Hello and welcome to a bonus episode of the World War II podcast. This episode is a thank you for all the kind words of support I have received and encouragement from you guys who regularly listen to the podcast, follow on Facebook, and for those of you who are patrons of the show. I do try to give a little bit extra back to patrons, but I also wanted to put something out as a big thank you to everyone. Last year in episode 53 I talked to Gabrielle McDonald-Rothwell about the SOE agent Diana Rowden. Well, after we'd stopped recording, Gabrielle told me about her husband Geoffrey Rothwell, who was the last surviving pilot for SOE during the war. At the time, she was in the process of checking through a biography of Geoff's experiences. Sadly, since then, Geoff has passed away. But Gabrielle has managed to complete the book recounting his life and wartime experiences, and it has now been released. The title is Last Man Standing. Gabrielle, welcome back. Geoff had an amazing life, and looking at his war record, it's incredible he even got through that. He joined the RAF as a pilot before even the outbreak of war, and I've always been led to believe that they preferred grammar school or public school boys when the RAF recruited. Was that Geoff's background?
No, not at all. He, as a child, he had this very, very definite thought in his head that he would love to be a pilot one day, because he grew up, of course, in the advent of aviation with all the Charles Kingsford Smith and all the famous aviators. He was very, very lucky enough to see one of the huge airships, the German Graf Zeppelin, and the British R101, the world's biggest airship. So he sort of grew up with this idea that it would be a wonderful thing to become an aviator. He also saw Sir Alan Cobham, the celebrated aviator, and he actually saw him force landing his aircraft, which was part of Cobham's flying circus. I mean, it was a wonderful age to actually be in, because this was the start of the great aviation period, the early aviation period, which of course grew very rapidly from the First World War right through to the Second World War, particularly during the 1930s, where women, of course, were flying. Your very famous Amy Johnson and the New Zealander Jean Batten, and so it was a wonderful age to be growing up. And of course, if you were a very impressionable young boy, what a wonderful thing. He could look up in the sky and he'd see people flying these light planes. He didn't do particularly well at school. It wasn't because he was lacking in brains, not at all. School, really, he was one of those people that just didn't click at school. I think his father said to him at one stage when he was about 16, he said to him, look, he said, Geoff, he said, if you don't come in the top half of your class, you'd better leave school. Well, he actually came 23 out of 26, so his father said, right, that's it. There is no point you staying at school. So anyway, he got a job with John Lang's, very, very famous London builder. He was actually sent to do some work on one of the airfields coming up. And one day when he was putting something up, cupboards or something in a wing commander's office, he plucked up courage and he said, sir, he said, I would really, really love to join the Air Force. Can you help me? And this wing commander looked at this tall, earnest, very strong boy, and he thought to himself, this is just the type of boy that we want to get into the Air Force. So that's what happened. So anyway, the only thing is, of course, when he was taken before the board, they asked him a lot of questions, and his father had said to him, Now, don't be nervous, boy. Look at the people sitting behind the desk and try and imagine what they would look like in bathing costumes. So Geoff decided to do this. So he sat down and the questions began. Do you play rugger? And he said, of course, because Geoff excelled at school. Do you drive a car? Actually, he did. He was able to drive an Austin, which was the family car. And have you ever flown in an aeroplane? Well, he had a joyride in a de Havilland Fox Moth. So the questions went on. Have you ever been airsick? Do you have any fear of heights, or have you been sick on a roundabout? Well, he was able to answer truthfully in the negative about all that. And suddenly, one of the members of this Air Force board asked him a question on maths, a trigonometry, which he didn't have a clue because maths was his very worst subject, and he'd never even heard of trigonometry. So at the conclusion of the interview, he was told that he had passed. Finally, he received a letter from the Air Ministry to say you have been accepted for a short service commission in the General Duties Branch of the Royal Air Force as a pilot, subject to the satisfactory completion of ab initio, which meant from the beginning, flying training at an elementary and reserve flying training school. But wait, with a proviso that you provide Air Ministry with a certificate to the effect that you have reached school certificate standard in the subject of trigonometry. So his heart sank. So there wasn't an earthly chance because he didn't even have elementary mathematics. One day he was talking to a commanding officer, Bill Hesketh, who was a charming, rugged wing commander, and he said to him, look, can you help me, please, sir? I really just have to get into the Air Force. To cut a long story short, someone coached him in mathematics, so he passed. He had a sort of a mind that even in mathematics, what he was taught, he just managed to sap it all up. So he passed, and he did very, very well. And of course, it was towards the end of 1938 when obviously everyone thought that they were going to come into another war. Obviously, Germany was being well prepared, and it was obvious that another war was going to come on. So the Royal Air Force at that stage was eagerly recruiting young men because obviously they knew that they would need to build up the Air Force.
It does make you wonder what these chaps thought with war approaching. For many, it would put them off. But I get the feeling for another large slice of people, it was an opportunity because it wasn't necessarily the war that they were interested in, but it was the chance of flying overcame everything.
I said to Geoff, I know you were desperate to fly, but did you not realise that your chances were, gosh, whatever it was? And he said, I never thought about that. He said, well, obviously we knew the odds, but I never even thought for a moment that something would happen to me. All I knew was that I wanted, more than anything else in the whole world, that I wanted to fly. He was obviously a breed of young men at that stage that they were all flocking in to join the services. They knew war was around the corner. And, I don't know, extremely brave, maybe foolhardy, remarkable, really, isn't it, when you think about it? Particularly flying, because you are the only one in the plane. I mean, I'm talking about, not talking about Bomber Command here, but they all had to learn to fly in one, the little biplanes and yeah.
It's hard for us to picture it because we know what flying is like, but in 1939, it was flying was only 30 some years old. I guess perhaps a comparison would be if you said to the average kid in the street, "Would you like to be an astronaut now?" And they'd all volunteer, irrespective of the fact that they might not survive because it's a dangerous business.
Yes, exactly. But Geoff, right from the word go, there was no looking back. He very, very quickly rose up through the ranks. They obviously realised that he had strong leadership skills. For a start, if I can read something that I've written down, from all my researching, from the people that I've spoken to years ago about him, he had a combination of extreme bravery. He was extremely strong character. He had leadership skills, and it was his positivity that combined everything, and why he rose very, very quickly right through the ranks of the Royal Air Force, which of course led to him being a flight commander. Jerry Jarvis. Now, Jerry Jarvis was a flight lieutenant, navigator and friend. He has passed away too. But something that he told me about Geoff, I will just read to you. He says, by sheer force of personality and by creating excellent relations with his pilots, Geoff's flight worked at peak efficiency with very high morale. With Geoff's exuberant spirit, there was really never a dull moment. That says a little bit more about him. He was a fascinating person. Even though I met him late in life, I'd never met anyone like him. We were friends a long time before we actually met in person. He took up a career which he'd never done before. I used to edit a magazine. This was a little bit later on. He actually found me, first of all. It was my first book, and Geoff and his former wife, Judy. Geoff and Judy used to run a bookshop up in Kerikeri in the Bay of Islands, and he saw this book that I'd written, my very first book, New Zealand Secret Heroes, and one day I just received a letter from a Geoffrey Rothwell up in Kerikeri, and the first sentence was, your fine book leads me to get in touch with you. You might, I have written a small book of something of my service during the war. And he never said anything. I had no idea that he had all these decorations. He didn't even say that he'd been in the Air Force. I never knew anything for weeks and weeks and weeks until someone said to me, Geoff Rothwell, do you realise that this Geoff Rothwell has won the DFCM Bar, 1939-45 Star, Aircrew Europe Star, Victory Medal, Order of Leopold II in Palme, Croix de Guerre in Palme, Bomber Command Medal, and last of all, La Légion d'honneur from Bomber Command. And I said, what? I said, I didn't even know that he even flew during the war. It wasn't until he got to know someone that he sort of reluctantly let them know what or else talked about him. So he was this very, very strange, terribly honest, terribly down to earth. The very first time that I met him, I expected in my career sort of as a journalist and war historian, I was very used to meeting veterans who were sort of elderly, stooped, also terribly reluctant to talk about what they did, but I soon learned how to get stuff from them. But when I first met Geoff, I was expecting someone like this, elderly, white-haired, whatever. Instead, I couldn't believe it. I met this very tall man, slim, very good-looking, still red-headed, with hair streaked with grey. It was like being knocked over by a tsunami. His hand held out in welcome, a big smile, who sort of put his arm around two of my children and welcomed us. The only way that I can describe it was being knocked over by a storm, like by the strong wind that blew in. And absolutely, completely open. What you saw is what you got. 26 years later, I'm still trying to work him out. Yes, incredible.
He would fly a tremendous amount of missions. So when it came to flying, one would assume that throughout his training, he's a natural and it all would come easy to him.
Well, it must have come fairly easy to him, but I think it lies in his character. I think he was absolutely determined to do very well in the Air Force, and it was through sheer guts, determination, and hard work that was at the basis of it. Also, he had, through being in high school, he was teased with his northern accent, and when he got into the Air Force, that northern accent was knocked out of him. Isn't it terrible? And that led him to a lifelong, not exactly disgust, but he was very, very against a class consciousness. He would have no part of that. And that was one reason that when he came to New Zealand, there was no difference between the classes. So that led to an intense dislike of anything like that. As he said to me, he said when he first joined the Air Force, the fact that he spoke with a northern accent, it was just knocked out of him. He said that people just said, look, if you're going to have a crew or else whatever, he said, you know, someone said to him, we have got to knock that accent out of you, which was terrible. But he said gradually, he just lost the accent. And I guess when you're with a whole crowd of people speaking in, well, not necessarily upper class, but he said it was just one of those things. And
so received pronunciation becomes the standard.
Yes. Oh, terrible, isn't it? But yeah.
So how do you end up in Bomber Command? Because presumably at this really early part of the war, we would have been short of fighter pilots rather than, I would have thought, bombers, with the Battle of Britain going on.
Geoff had one ambition right from a young boy, to fly a single-seated Spitfire. And with the result that when he was in training with a lot of his friends, he was just called Spit because he never stopped talking about Spitfires. But when he completed his training, the wing commander, whatever, when he went before him, when he knew that he'd passed with flying colours, I think the flight commanders told him in no uncertain terms that Geoff was too tall to go into a Spitfire. And he said, with those long legs of yours, my boy, you just wouldn't fit into a Spitfire. It's bombers for you. When we talked about it in later years, Geoff said, well, look, it may have been one of the reasons why he was alive, because in Fighter Command they did lose an awful lot of pilots. Also, there were huge losses in Bomber Command too, but maybe the odds were slightly higher being in Bomber Command. We will never know. He was the sort of person who lived for the here and now. Quite often he'd say to me, look, yesterday is gone. We are living today. Don't think about the future. Don't think about the past. Just live for today, which obviously was a good thing if you were a leader of men. And when he was in Bomber Command, some of his crew, some would be anxious. There would always be the nervous pee against the side of the aircraft before climbing in the bomber. But he said, strangely enough, he said he never thought about anything like that. He said he couldn't bear, because he said he had this crew which was his crew. There was no room for any negativity at all. And I'll just tell you something funny which happened in, I think, a couple of months before Geoff passed. We were talking about blood groups, and I had temporarily forgotten what type of blood he had, but I knew it was A, and mine is A too. And I said, negative or positive. And he said, what? He said, there's nothing negative about me at all. He said, I I am A positive. And I don't think it was necessarily drummed into these young men, you know, the ones going into fighter command, the ones going into bomber command. I think it was just, there was no room for anything like that. And fortunately, men like Geoff, they couldn't even waste time thinking about it. The people that I've spoken to said they're absolutely certain that that's why he and his crew lasted as long as they did. And eventually we'll start talking about the reasons why he did crash, which was totally something that we never got to grips with, and even to this day he just doesn't know what happens, but that's somewhere down the track. But for someone to have survived more than 70 operations, I think that was truly incredible.
The pace of the war for these men I find it quite incredible, especially when I was when you read through the tours. So he did his first tour in 1940, and he gets a distinguished flying cross 8 months after qualifying, which is incredible. But it's not as if the first tour is a walk in the park. There's numerous scrapes and bumps along the track, and to remain positive, to be willing to. Well, I don't know, they have no choice, but...
He was a bit of a daredevil. We went back to England in 2001, and Geoff said that he wanted to show me where the airfields that he flew from, and it was wonderful. We met up with his sitter, Stanley Erd. Oh, he was an absolute darling. He was a little bit older than Geoff, but one of the funniest things that he told me, Stan... He was a Yorkshireman, one of those wonderful Yorkshiremen, tremendous sense of humour, very honest, very straight. He would tell the most extremely funny stories with a straight face, you know, incredible person. But anyway, he said to me that Geoff used to test fly, a lot of aircraft, and he'd take up the ground crew with him, one of which was Stan, and he said he'd be crazy. He said your husband was entirely mad. He'd fly an enormous aircraft like a Sterling, go very, very low, and he'd fly between two buildings. And he said we would be huddled, we would be covering our eyes. And he said it was no wonder after being on service. I mean, he'd come back from an operation, and every time there'd be dings and dents and things off. Sometimes I think there was one when he crash landed on Newmarket Heath on the main road, this enormous Sterling, and it was absolutely incredible. And there's a famous photo. I'm sure that they put it in the book, and it shows the Sterling. Yes, here it is. It's in the middle where the photos are. It says the two images on the left show Geoff Sterling after a mission to Germany, while he was stationed at Downham when he was in 218 Squadron. They were taken as evidence of the damage that was caused after what Geoff believed was contact with a high-tension pylon, and how the aircraft looked as if it had been cut open with a can opener, and the Daily Telegraph reported that too. But he did do crazy things. He was a bit of a daredevil. His sister Pat, who is still alive, she's 10 years younger than Geoff. In fact, I think I quote what she said. He would dive bomb the farmhouse where Pat and his parents were living down in the countryside. He would dive bomb it. He once beat up Pat's school, where all the children came running out and saw this big plane coming down, flying low. And he even dive bombed one of the wing commander's weddings at the Ginger Coal. And you would have probably read about all the crazy things, he and his crew did, like knocking wefts off bicycles, raiding the group captains with asparagus beds. He had this crazy sense of humour, and Wing Commander Wilf Burnett, who wrote the foreword we saw him when he was living in Surrey, in Hazelmere, and he said he couldn't believe it when Geoff was posted as missing. He said, you never thought anything would happen to Geoff. He was bulletproof. He was accident-proof. After all the scrapes and things that he'd got out of, we just couldn't believe that suddenly the aircraft just didn't return. At that stage, of course, he was a pilot. He was at Tempsford, SOE. And special duties, of course, was an extremely dangerous part of the war. It wasn't just going to Germany. He was flying in countries like Denmark, Norway, dropping agents between mountains, and it was extremely dangerous. And of course,
he's a hugely experienced pilot at this point, because he's done his 75 ops.
Absolutely, hugely experienced. You should see his logbook. Honestly, it's absolutely amazing. This logbook is so precious, and you see all the comments. When they returned from a mission, they would have to get their logbook signed, and you see the stamps in it. Above average, incredible flying. Even though he didn't want to go on leave, they made him go, or else he would go into instructing, and he hated those periods. He thought those were the real difficult part of the war. He said to me he just couldn't leave fast enough. But of course they did have to rest them. They had to rest the pilots. You can understand why.
And he gets these training posts, and he seemingly can't get out of them fast enough. And I wondered, you would have thought that it would be nice to have a change of pace, because they're flying incredibly regularly on missions. It's not as if they were every once in a blue moon. And you would have thought that the stress...
And long missions to Germany. He never ceased to amaze me, honestly. He was a larger-than-life character. I liken him... James Bond, look, it's the only sort of character that I can come up with, James Bond, woman falling at his feet and all that. He went from all that time in the war and the crash prison of war, and then he volunteers to go to Malaya, which was another dreadful, terribly dangerous work, where he was shot at and he comes away unscathed. My first book about him, The Man with 9 Lives. I mean, he didn't have 9 lives. He had 99 lives. He had more than a cat.
Am I right in saying he does his 75 missions and then he's due to go on a training mission, another training posting, and his way of escaping from the training position is to volunteer to fly the agents into occupied Europe?
Yes, absolutely. Geoff, with a strong personality, clashed with this chap who was running the station. The name, just I can't think of the name just offhand, but they nearly came to blows. But Geoff wanted to leave. Stevens, that's the one, and he wanted to get away, and he wanted to go on active service. But that guy refused to let him go. In the end, he actually had to go to someone that he had flown under a couple of years previous. Stevens did not want to let Geoff go, but he made his life so miserable that it took 3 calls. It took one from Mousefielden. He was a crew to the King, but he was also a captain of the King's flight, and someone had to go to him in order to overstep Stevens. They had to go up to the top level in order to get Geoff to leave where he was and to join SOE, because in order to even fly for SOE, you really had to be the cream of the crop. They only took very experienced pilots, and nearly all of them were highly decorated pilots, like Geoff. At that stage in the war, in 1944, they were pretty desperate, but they wouldn't lower their standards. Well, they couldn't wait to get Geoff. But as I said, strings had to be pulled. to get him in, and straight away there again he would volunteer for all these terribly dangerous missions. And Wilf Burnett, I think he writes in his foreword, he said Geoff wanted to volunteer for everything. He said I had to sort of say to him, look, let the others have a go. But Geoff would counteract that by saying that his crew were the most experienced. They had far more chance of succeeding in these missions than some of the other crews that weren't so experienced. So, in other words, he kept putting his life on the line, and his crew would have walked over water for him. They were such a tight group. It is absolutely the most incredible story. In 1956, when he was manager of a rubber estate in Malaya, William Holden and a crew from America wanted to film a movie called The Seventh Dawn. Now, I've seen this twice. Geoff had a small part in it. At the conclusion of the filming, William Holden, who had obviously heard a lot about Geoff, said, look, man, he said, oh, my God, he said, your life, he said, it should be filmed. He said, look, he said, I've spoken to someone in producer. They really want you to go out to America to discuss the very strong possibility of a film being made about you. But Geoff didn't do anything about it. He said, oh, no. Typical Geoff. But, what a film it would make.
You've alluded to his final mission for SOE. Do you want to run us through what happened? Because that's quite remarkable in itself.
We actually met the agent that he dropped, Bram de Vos. He dropped two agents, first of all, Peter de Vos and Tobias B. Loftus-Bersky, and they were returning to Holland to join the Dutch resistance in the fields. Now, Geoff's conducting officer, or the agents, a chap called Bunny Warren, was said to him, now this mission, there shouldn't be any worries, you're being taken by one of the best crews in 138 Squadron. So they climb into the Sterling. They do everything by now. I mean, they're so experienced. And Geoff said to the men, he said, don't worry about this. This trip's a piece of cake, and I'll get you there without any trouble. So Sterling, you uncle, so it headed east across the coast. They were halfway to the ETA, and looking in the direction of the Dutch coast lying ahead, Geoff saw a giant cumulonimbus cloud directing in their path. Now, this was contrary to the Met report that had said that there were no weather problems that night. And little did he know that one other sortie from Tempsford had been aborted and returned to base. So Geoff debated whether or not to climb above the cloud, thereby giving the German radar warning of the approach, or attempt to fly straight through it. In the end, he realized it would be impossible to gain enough height to fly over the cloud, and decided to climb from his present level of 500 feet and enter the cloud at around 6,000 feet. It was so rough going that the agents in the back thought that the heavy throwing about of the aircraft was caused by flying over a flak barrage of the Dutch coast. So Geoff followed the plan for flying through the storms, which was to maintain straight and level. That was something that they all learned. Through a storm, just try and keep straight and level. However, it was contrary to his instinct and all he had learned in his years of operational flying. Turbulence was so great that the huge Sterling was tipping from one wingtip to the other and plunging up and down. But he kept saying to himself, straight and level, straight and level. Eventually, fearing structural damage if he remained in the cloud, he decided to drop down to sea level, and lo and behold, everything was sort of quieter down below. The storm had abated and they were in brilliant moonlight again. So they made landfall over Horseshoe Bay on Vlieland, which is a small island in the Frisian group. He dropped the agents. That all went fine. So from then on, they flashed the Morse code letter to say the signal, for the signal to go ahead, and the barman pressed the light switch and said, "Let him go, Bob." The green light flashed, the agents jumped out, Joe's gone. So the Sterling flew on for a while and circled once over open country to confuse any Germans around in case the radar had picked up the aircraft. But by now the wind had strengthened and shifted. So back on board the Sterling, the containers of arms and ammunition were dropped and the carrier pigeons were flown out in their cardboard boxes on the way back. The job was well done and the aircraft returned to the pinpoint on the causeway, and Geoff altered course to bring them over Vlieland again. And Roger Court, who was the map reader, said, "Skip, we're a little to port." They were still flying at a height of 300 feet, and Mac the navigator came up to the cockpit to see for himself. But just as he looked through the windscreen, the Sterling staggered as if it had hit something solid. Geoff saw immediately that he'd picked up speed and instinctively hauled back on the control column with all his strength, but he knew that they were going to stall. And he asked Mac, "Quick, give me the emergency course to base." And Mac said, "Steer 270 to start with," but everything happened in the aircraft from then on. The needle dropped to the bottom of the scale. The Sterling went into a sharp dive. Then the starboard inner propeller flew off and fire broke out in the engine, rapidly spreading to the wing. Fuel pressure was lost in 3 engines. They were still flying over water and too low to bail out. Geoff gripped the wheel, fighting to keep the Sterling on a straight course, but they were rapidly losing height. There was no time to be nervous or to feel despair. There was no time to think of anything to say his last prayers or to wonder whether he and the crew would survive. Quite coolly, he knew they were going to crash, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to prevent that happening. "Ditching stations, everybody," he yelled over the intercom. As the Sterling dropped like a stone, he could see sand dunes ahead and then a hillock, and he knew that they were going to crash head on. He heard Mac yelling that the starboard wing was stalling. Seconds later, "You, Uncle," hit the ground with a gigantic thud, and I describe it as the land and the moon danced around him, and he was aware of being hurled against the control column, the sickness rising in his stomach, and the noises of metal breaking up as the Sterling completely broke up before he was being picked up and thrown like a rag doll violently through the cockpit roof. Then all receded and he lost consciousness. When he did eventually wake up with sand in his eyes and mouth, he saw some distance away the Sterling on fire, and he tried to get his thoughts together, but obviously he had been unconscious, and he tried to get up, and he was looking at the wreckage, and not too far away he saw Mac, the navigator, with a deep, nasty gash on his shin, and there was no signs of the others. And then he saw Bob Wilmot, one of the crew, with one of his legs sticking out, with a fragment of bone sticking out, and they didn't know whether or not anyone was left on the Sterling. They couldn't get anywhere near the Sterling because there was an enormous fire. They just didn't know what to do. And then Geoff said even though they were both in a state of shock and concussed with raging thirst, and they just knew that they had to get away quickly because the Germans most likely would have seen the Stirling coming down, and Texel is a very small island, and of course Germans were on it. Just to cut a long story short, they didn't even know what the situation was on Texel, but Geoff only had one shoe. One of his shoe had come off, and they thought if they saw any signs of a house or whatever, they would knock. They would try and wake up the people to ask for shelter or at least for water. Of course, they didn't know what part of the island they were on. They had to walk across a field. They saw dim lights ahead. And the next day, when they came back, they saw a notice in German, Uptown Minen. They had walked through a minefield, which they didn't even know. So anyway, one of the Dutchmen that they did knock up, who let them sleep the night in a little sort of like a little rabbit hut thing, gave them plenty of water. But the next day, he said to them, look, he said, there's no way that you can escape from this island. The Germans have commandeered all the boats. And he said, what are you going to do? And Geoff and Mac discussed it and said, look, there's nothing else we can do other than to give ourselves up. They were also really worried about the remainder of their crew because they thought that they were the only two survivors. So in the end, the man who had sheltered them, the Dutchman, got in touch with the German commandant on the island, and they came to arrest them. Right up to the time that Geoff passed, we were still discussing why the Stirling crashed. When he got to a prisoner of war camp, he was interviewed. A chap by a German called Bauer, who spoke excellent English. He spoke it with an Oxford accent, and he did say to Geoff, he said, we knew you were coming, old boy. You didn't know, he said, you didn't know that there was a mole working in your SOE, did you? Geoff didn't believe it.
It's all rather remarkable, this interrogation by this German.
Absolutely incredible. He brought out a file on Geoff. He said it was extraordinary. He said the file started as far back as when he was in 99, which was in 1940, when he first flew with the RAF. It was incredible. So there were many question marks. We talked about a lot. Geoff sort of suddenly came to the conclusion that that the Stirling might have hit a barrage balloon that, considering they flew through that terrible storm, it might have weakened the airframe. Something might have happened, but he said on talking to the Germans later in prisoner of war camp, and they said, as far as they knew, there was one other thing, was that night fighters might have shot him down, but no, there were no night fighters that night. Now, meeting Bauer had a lot of information about Tempsford. He didn't obviously know where it was, but he knew all about SOE. He knew it was a hidden aircraft. He knew about the flight commanders like a Group Captain Joe Fogarty, someone called Group Captain Evan Evans, and there was definitely a Group Captain Evan Evans, but Bauer called him Good Evans, and of course, actually, the poor Group Captain Evans DVC was killed in 1944, but he also mentioned names like Charles Pickard. Charles Pickard was in 161 SOE, very, very famous. He led a raid on Amiens prison in France. He was actually killed on that raid, but he was a big part of Bomber Command and SOE. There's a lot of books about Charles Pickard. Other names of people that Geoff couldn't figure out why Bauer would know so much, but I quote here what Geoff said. Bauer says, "We have, shall we say, a little bird who works in your SOE, ha ha. You didn't know that, old chap, did you? It's very strange. And Professor Michael Foote, who was one of the most authoritative writers on SOE, makes several references to security in SOE, perhaps most illuminating in his chapter on security and penetration in his book, SOE 1940 to 46. And I just put in this paragraph, considering how leaky SOE's own agents could be, in spite of all that they'd been taught at Beaulieu about the need to keep their mouths shut when in enemy hands, it is not surprising that captured sub and sub-sub agents often said a great deal more than they might have done and helped the enemy's security forces in their task of unraveling what SOE was up to. And in another book by Michael Foote, he says, in both the War Office and the Air Ministry, about 40 busybodies in each had arranged by the end of 1940 to see in clear a copy of every message that entered the building. Most of them belonged to the same service clubs, where over a late whiskey they liked to exchange news of the day. So, I mean, look, we will never exactly know what happened. Barr was obviously trying to get as much information from Geoff, but he did get nasty in the end when Geoff refused to tell him anything. Barr said to him, "Look, reconsider, old boy. Cooperate with us and life will be easier. Let's face it, I could, shall we say, make life more agreeable for you. I can arrange for you to go into the town, go to the cinema, have a meal. In fact, I can even arrange some female company for you. On the other hand, you have acted like a thug and you should be treated like one. I could hand you straight over to the Gestapo." The situation was definitely heating up, and Geoff asked Bauer to take him back to his cell. He had turned out to be a nasty bit of work, and he was not going to talk any longer with a bastard like him. And he said to him, "I've no wish to listen to abuse from the likes of you." He never saw Bauer again. After the war, Bauer received 18 months imprisonment from a war crimes tribunal for the ill treatment of prisoners. It's a strange thing. Professor Theo Boyton, war historian and author from Groningen University, said that he had access to a lot of German files, and he said he couldn't see anything that could have brought that Stirling down. That night, because of the storm, there were no fighters up. Geoff thought, well, maybe, it could have had something to do with the storm, perhaps.
It's such catastrophic failure, isn't it? That's the thing about it. It's not as if it's an engine, it's catastrophic, that failure of his plane.
Yes, because 3 of the crew died. I always felt it was unfinished business. Geoff, as I said, was an extremely positive man. I knew we were in I will swear here and say deep shit when Geoff suddenly would talk about the crew that he lost. And I knew that there was a lot of unfinished business. Maybe he blamed him. Well, he wasn't the sort to go down the negative road, as I said, but he said he felt the loss of those 3 crew members very, very deeply. And as I said, in Anzac Day, when he'd be watching the services, this is when these things came out, and he'd also be talking about his friends that he lost in the Air Force, the early friendships that he made, that he always used to talk about. Fred Pilot Officer Freddie Harold and Joe Reddy, John Allen, his very first friend, when he joined Squadron Leader Bill Greenslade, Louis Aaron, who won the VC, and then the 3 from his crew, Roger Court, Wally Walton, and Flying Officer John Holm, who lost their lives on this fateful mission over Texel. And that's when he'd say, well, why me? Why was I? Why did I escape this fate. And then I would tease him, and I'd say, well, because you were destined to meet me. But, all joking aside, he was vulnerable sometimes. And Geoff was 18 when he did his first mission. 18, 19 years of age. Can you imagine anyone of that age now doing the type of work that those wonderful young boys did? Can you imagine flying 10, 12 hours into enemy territory, being shot at, strafed, flak? It's absolutely incredible. And then to do it year after year, to do it 5, almost 6 long years of war.
And he's a squadron leader by, is it 2021?
Yes, he's a squadron leader. And had he survived the last mission, then he would have become a wing commander.
I can't imagine at 21 being in charge of not just a crew of people, a big group of people on a big aircraft fighting a war. I mean, the responsibility on a young chap must be tremendous, and how they coped with how they coped with stress defeats me. But I have to say, he was full of drinking anecdotes. He seemed to have been a great raconteur.
He actually had this enormous sense of humour, and I think it must have been a way, raiding the group captain's asparagus beds and knocking wafts off bicycle, which wasn't intentional, but of course going back to base, drunk, of course, half cut, because although the wartime beer had been watered down, they drank such enormous quantities of it, but they had to do these things, otherwise they possibly couldn't have had the means to carry on. I mean, they had to let their hair down. There were a few things that happened. I quote his commanding officer, Ginger Cole. Geoff was always being brought up on the carpet for one reason or other. Like at one stage, they were trying to bring a horse. To bring a horse in to where they were staying and take the poor horse up these stairs to put it into the group captain's bedroom. But then they had to let off steam. Anyway, he was hauled up on a carpet in front of Ginger Cole. He said, I know what you've been going through. I think it's time that we sent you off to another unit, and please take 2 weeks off. You have to, because, as I said, they were flying night after night, and they might have 1 or 2 days off, but if they were short-handed, Geoff again would volunteer.
And he finishes the war as a prisoner of war in Stalag Luft 1. How was that a change of pace? Because that's again another change of pace for a man who has seen continual action really throughout the war. That must have been not a struggle, but it must have been very difficult to suddenly have your life curtailed like that.
Absolutely. I think he found it terribly difficult at first. He did meet up with some of his friends that he'd known, but the fact that they were locked up and guarded everywhere, they were in barracks, even the fact that there was little food, that came down the list. It was the fact that going from a life full of excitement, even though it was terribly dangerous, it must have been very, very difficult. He did make some wonderful friendships, of which one was a Polish squadron leader, Dan Art, who, after the war, became very famous as a writer, and he actually wrote a lot about Geoff, and Dan became Geoff's very best friend and prisoner of war. But one of the things that they found quite humorous was the fact that they would tease the guards. Half of the time they didn't really realize what the prisoners were doing. For instance, Geoff and Dan would take walks around the compound wherever possible, and they would greet the guards smilingly, and they'd say to him, "Good morning, you square-headed bastards." And other times Dan would change this to "Guten Morgen." and the guards didn't know what they were talking about, and some would say Guten Morgen, they would answer that. And shortly before Geoff and Dan arrived in Bart, which is on the Baltic coast, absolutely freezing cold, there was a Major Schroeder, and it soon became known that the British prisoners of war were taking off the guards and things like that. And he sent around a communique, circulated it throughout Stalag Luft 1. It was addressed to the senior British and American officers in all the compounds, and it says, I can just read you this quickly. It says, use of the word goon. The use of the word goon was granted to the POWs by the Commandant under the condition that this word would not have any dubious meaning. It has, however, been reported to me that some of the POWs have been using the goon up, the meaning of which is beyond any doubt. Consequently, the use of the word goon up or goon is prohibited, severest punishment being in future inflicted for any disobedience against this order. But Geoff and Dan used to just keep on saying it because I suppose they had to have some relief. It was 1944, of course, at that stage. Though the tide of the war had turned, they still didn't know how long they would be prisoners, whether or not in the end, they would win the war. There must have been the big question marks. And, of course, a lot of people got sick and they hardly had any food. Geoff often describes that period as when the food got perilously low, when even the Germans hardly had any food left in the camp because the Red Cross parcels weren't getting through to all the POW camps. And he said it got so bad that he said they would lie on their bunks during the day because they had no energy. They couldn't play football anymore. They couldn't do anything much. And they used to dream about all the wonderful meals that they used to have, but he said it got to the stage that when they got up, they would nearly pass out because they were so weak. The body was becoming dangerously weak. And if it hadn't have been for the fact that finally some Red Cross parcels came to dribble through, I'm hazarding a guess here, I think it was February or March 1945, if they hadn't have got those parcels, many would have died. And even someone as strong as Geoff,
It's amazing in war-torn Europe that the Red Cross parcels somehow managed to sort of come through towards its end period where it's hugely confusing in Europe. It's amazing that they can get them through.
Yes, their daily diet consisted at that stage of 4 thin slices of black bread, 1 or 2 potatoes, or kohlrabi, as they called it, which was a type of turnip. The latter, and this is Geoff's words, the latter being cattle fodder, was so tasteless, according to Geoff and Dan, that a respectable cow would refuse to consume it. A tiny scraping of margarine and 3 or 4 cups of the evil-tasting German ersatz coffee, which wasn't fit for human consumption. So every morsel of food was more precious than gold, and sometimes they would try and sell a piece of bread in return for something else. It was just... It must have been an extremely difficult period. We can't imagine it because they were literally living off the fat of their bodies. And
so the camps eventually liberated. I was surprised at the speed they returned into Britain. I sort of thought that they would get stuck somehow in transit camps, but they're flown back to the UK, which must have been thrilling to be returning and thrilling for RAF men to be returning by plane.
The RAF I think they just wanted to get their Air Force men back. But when Geoff returned, who was one of the first person that he saw in a group was this dreaded guy that had done so much to prevent him from joining SOE. But look, he said Stevens didn't see him, fortunately. But Geoff told me about that period. He said it was very strange for several months. He couldn't see anyone. His father took him for a walk along one of the beaches. Some of them still had the barbed wire, and he said he remembers saying to his father, "Oh, Dad, we must return now because we're not supposed to walk along the beaches." And his father had to remind him that the war was over. And he said he just remembers spending time soaking up the sun and lying in a deck chair. He was able to read the papers, but he would say to his mother, "Oh, is it all right? Can I have a beetroot sandwich," or something like that? And his mother would say, "Of course, Geoff, you don't have to ask. Help yourself." And he said it was the most strange period. He said he withdrew into himself, which wasn't like him. But he said once he came out of that and swapped stories with some of his friends that had similar stories, it was something to do with the fact that he'd been a prisoner, that a combination of a lot of things, I guess.
I wondered, because he remains in the RAF for a period after the war, but if he needed that period almost to, because he decided, the RAF doesn't decide, the RAF want him, he decides not to, he doesn't want to be with the RAF, but I wondered if he needed that period to unwind from the war. He needed to be in the RAF, but in the structure, but he needs to, I don't know, almost breathe out.
Yes. They were wanting him to resit his exams, and post-war, once he got his health back and everything, he ferried a lot of aircraft around, Africa, Egypt, and things like that. So for the first couple of years, he was in transport command there again. I mean, he was caught up in this big smuggling thing that was called the Radmilovic affair, smuggling a communist Yugoslavia, which he thought was a man, which turned out to be a very attractive woman out of Yugoslavia. Anyway, look, he managed to get out of that. Even post-war, he went from one huge adventure to the next. Incredible. But he was actually posted to Italy, which he loved very much, and we talked about Italy. He said it was one of the happiest times in his life, that he would take leaves and he would go to the Amalfi Coast, and that was a happy period in his life, even though his first marriage was sort of starting to unravel at that time. But you'd have read the book, you'd have heard about one of his great loves, this girl that he never ended up, unfortunately, they never got married in the end.
Her name right now is rushed out of my head. Judy? No. Pat? No, that's his sister.
No, he married a girl called Valerie after he returned to England from being a prisoner of war. It was one of those very quick post-war marriages that they married in haste, and a huge percentage of them didn't work out. The one love of his life at that stage was Pat, this lovely girl that he'd met, and Pat's first husband flew with Geoff. They were good friends, and that's how he met Pat. Pat's husband was killed, and it was Geoff's job as commanding officer to write these letters to the next of kin or to the wives. So anyway, they eventually fell in love, but during the war they didn't, for some reason, I couldn't pin them down, they just didn't get married. It was her father that told Geoff about a job he could go to Malaya to be, to work there as a rubber planter. And it was then that he met Pat again, and it started up again. By that time, she had divorced this second husband of hers, and it was all set in stone that at that time she actually had a little boy, and she was going to move out to Malaya and bring the little boy with her. But the husband would not hear of it. But as the husband wouldn't agree to his child being taken to another country, that was that. So Pat said she couldn't leave the little boy behind, and it broke Geoff's heart. So eventually he ended up marrying Judy, who was a widow. So they got married. When he married me in 2001, we met up with Pat, and she was everything that Geoff had told me about. He's just one of those ones where they didn't get together.
Well, I was going to say, we've covered his war. I mean, we could do another whole episode about his adventures as a rubber planter in Malaya, because that in itself is an incredible, and pretty much, the Malaysian emergency is another bit of history that never really gets much of a look in. I guess it's overlooked by other things.
So Geoff, in effect, went from one war straight into another. It was extremely dangerous. Well, Geoff spent 20 years there in Malaya, and of which some of those, at that time, he was married met Judy and married her and officially adopted Judy's little boy, Simon. They left it in, I think it was 1968, 1969, and again there was still this unrest, and where it was very dangerous to be living in the country. One thing he told me was that a friend of Judy's, they would have something called an icebox. There were no such things as fridges there, and she opened the icebox one day to see a severed head of one of her friends sitting in the icebox. So when that happened, it was almost like the last straw, and Geoff and Judy decided to leave Malaya. It was difficult for them because Geoff said too that was an extremely happy period. He just loved Malaya, and he loved the Malays, who are gentle people, and so they eventually moved to New Zealand and settled in the Bay of Islands, which is an extraordinarily beautiful part of New Zealand. So he truly has lived an extraordinary life, and you would read about it in a novel, but this is all true. This is the extraordinary part of it. I mean, it was just all true. As I said, I liken him very much to James Bond character, but even more so. And he would, if he knew that I was telling you this and saying it, he would say, "Oh, nonsense! Look, I never did anything." That sort of thing, he would say. But it was amazing when you look at what he did. It's absolutely.
It's incredible. And right at the start of the book, you say that Geoff states he can't understand why anyone would write a book about him, and I would, look, if he read back his own exploits, about himself, did he realise what a remarkable life that he had had?
Well, in his book, of which this Last Man Standing, I could use a lot of it. When he read it, I said, "Now do you believe that's why you called the man with 9 lives?" He said, "Oh, yeah, well," he looked and he said, "Oh, well, I suppose, yeah," he would sort of say things like that. And he said, "Oh, yes, but such and such did much more than me. Oh, and one thing I've got to, absolutely, one thing, this is extremely important. He always used to say it was a joint effort. The medal should have gone to the men. They did far more He never accepted the fact that, he said it's very wrong. He said the medal should have been given to everyone. He said it was a joint effort. He said the pilot alone wouldn't have done it. He had to have a map reader and the engineer and everything. That was a topic that he was very hot on. And he said it's wrong. He said it was a group effort. The pilot was only one of them. He was, I think he said he was just the guy flying the damned aircraft. But of course, our crew is only as good as its captain, isn't it? He never thought like that, though. Right up to the end, he never thought.
What a remarkable man. Gabrielle, thank you for sharing his story. Loyal listener, if you want to read Geoff's story, the book is Last Man Standing by Gabrielle McDonald-Rothwell. It would make a great Christmas gift if you're struggling to find one for someone. As ever, I'll put a link on the website. So that's all for now. I look forward to being with you once again on the 1st of December. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.